problem.
Order, please. Just ask the honourable members to shorten up the questions, please. Time is getting a bit long, some of these. So the honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier about the Kyoto Protocol. That treaty is an international obligation entered into by the federal government on behalf of the nation as a whole. The federal government has agreed to reduce greenhouse gases to 6% below 1990 levels. But of course, under the Constitution, responsibility for the environment is split between the federal and provincial governments. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier will tell us whether his government has adopted or does it reject that same target for Nova Scotia as a whole.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Energy.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
You're on your feet. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to thank the honourable member for the question. It's an important one that we have to address. And really it's one of trying to acquire the balance of the federal plan and what has been brought forward recently by the Government of Canada. We're working very hard on initiatives right now in partnership with industry and the not-for-profit sector. And we will be forthcoming with a framework with regards to Nova Scotia's response. I want to assure the member it's at the forefront, but exact compliance is really about Nova Scotia's capability. We have limited resources. We are trying to deal with a federally mandated initiative, and we'll do what Nova Scotians can afford to do with regards to Kyoto.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukto on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's obvious to all members of the House that that wasn't an answer. The national commitment is for 6% below 1990 levels for greenhouse gas reductions. That's a very low number given just how serious the worldwide problem is. Now, just how serious it is was illustrated most recently in the last couple of weeks by the UN's Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report. How any level of government cannot be mobilizing all of its resources to tackle this problem is beyond me. Again, back to the Premier. Will the Premier commit today to endorsing for Nova Scotians at least the same level of greenhouse gas reduction as the federal government has adopted for Canada as a whole?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and I refer that to the Minister of Energy.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
And again, Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member, it isn't about Nova Scotia's willingness to comply and to participate. It's about our ability to do that. And we will do what Nova Scotians can afford to do, and we'll bring that framework forward to the honourable member. And I could provide him with many examples, Mr. Speaker. We're working across this entire province on trying to meet those targets within our existing capacity, and we are going to work within the federal window and the programs they put forward to match up with industry and governments. And I think the honourable member will be very pleased in the coming days about Nova Scotia's response and meeting our targets.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukto on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the province cannot afford not to meet those targets. Greenhouse gases are, broadly speaking, associated with three areas of energy use. One's transportation, a second is heating, a third is electricity. If the Premier is not prepared to commit to an overall strategy for the province as a whole, will he at least commit to the minus 6% target for any one of those sectors?
The Honourable Minister of Energy. Oh, the Honourable Premier.
Thank you. That was a good choice, Mr. Speaker, and I yield to your advice. The Minister of Energy.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, the honourable member is talking about a protocol that the Government of Canada signed without proper consultation with the provinces, and we have in good faith been working with them to try and make Nova Scotia compliant, to make sure we're meeting the targets as best we can. And if he just takes, for instance, where Nova Scotians have responded to initiatives of this government with the Keep the Heat program, where over 12,000 workers were out cleaning furnaces, the 5,000 energy kits. We're working actively, whether it's with Climate Nova Scotia, with the Ecology Action Group, with ACAP Cape Breton. We're working across this province, Mr. Speaker, and again, we have to have the proper time to give the appropriate response, and the type of measures that he's asking for require government be prudent and diligent in our response, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, it was reported today that indeed more surgeries are being cancelled next month at the QE2 because of a shortage of anesthesiologists, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the NDP had their turn. Maybe it's time they shut their yaps and let us have our turn.
Order, please. Order, please. Order. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. That's unparliamentary. And ask the honourable member to stand. Retract that, please.
I retract that statement,
Thank
Mr.
you, sir.
Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it was reported today that more surgeries are being cancelled next month at the QE2 because of a shortage of anesthesiologists. So much for the Premier's plan, Mr. Speaker, to fix health care for $46 million way back in 1999. This government is now spending $1 billion more on health than they did 5 years ago, and still surgeries are being cancelled due to a lack of specialists. In February, the QE2 was 9 anesthesiologists, expecting to have one person hired in March and another in May. They were short 9. My question to the Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker, the Minister please tell Nova Scotians what has happened to cause more surgery cancellations at this province's largest medical facility.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated in answer to a previous question, the situation we're dealing with respect to the shortages of anesthesiologists is not a problem that is unique to Canada. It's a problem that is being faced by all other jurisdictions. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I spent time a couple of weekends ago with the ministers of health from across Canada, a Liberal minister in Quebec, a Liberal minister in Ontario, a Liberal minister in British Columbia, who are facing exactly the same problems that we're facing with respect to recruitment. What we are doing in this province, Mr. Speaker, through alternate funding programs is we're experiencing some limited success in terms of recruitment. We're going to continue to work with the Capital District to narrow that margin, Mr. Speaker, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to have everything up running full steam by September.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows full well that the alternate funding plans have ended. The government is spending $1 billion more on health. The system is still broken. Surgeries are cancelled. Nova Scotians are waiting and waiting and waiting. Many of them are in pain, and they still have to wait for surgery. My question again to the Minister of Health. What programs or plans does the Minister have in place right now that are going to help people who have been bumped from their list to list waiting for surgery?
The honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member is referencing the situation with respect to the Department of Medicine. That does not impact the anesthesiologists. However, Mr. Speaker, there is progress being made with respect to the entire issue. And, Mr. Speaker, our efforts at recruitment are experiencing some success. And as a result of that success, we hope to be able to get back to full operation in the very near future.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my question would be, how long do we have to wait? The people who are scheduled for surgery next month have now been shuffled aside because this government continues to neglect the needs of Nova Scotians. Let me ask my final question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker. It's been 6 years and 3 health ministers, and still you have not gotten it right, Mr. Premier. As a doctor, how can you justify making people wait for necessary surgery while your health department continues to lose specialists in this province?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member brings to the attention of the members of the House a very serious issue, and that is the lack of anesthesiologists right across this country. And despite the fact that there is a very aggressive recruitment program going on, we are shy anesthesiologists in our province. It is more, Mr. Speaker, than an issue about money. It is the lack of a comprehensive plan nationwide to provide the right number of anesthesiologists for the country of Canada. And until we address some of these human resource issues, Mr. Speaker, on the national basis, we will not be successful as a province.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, Jim McEachern lives in Harrietsfield in my riding, a place notorious in medical circles for its poor water quality. But Mr. McEachern is ill and he doesn't have much money for well testing. Neither do his neighbours. So they take turns getting their wells tested about once every 2 years each. And in the meantime, there are widespread suspicions of serious contaminants in the water table that really will need more expensive testing. My question is for the Minister of Environment. Why is this government willing to pay for the treatment of illnesses caused by waterborne disease, but not for the testing that would prevent the spread of those illnesses?
Now, the Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite would know, we certainly encourage all Nova Scotians to have their water tested on a regular basis. We appreciate that there is a cost associated with that, but in this particular instance, I can assume, and we can discuss this later, that the tests are taking place on an alternate basis, and they found no signs of contaminants so that they can determine what the water is like in their area at this point in time.
The honourable member for Halifax Landing on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I suspect that assuming is a pretty dangerous public health risk in itself. In any case, many residents in Harrietsfield also believe that contaminated soil, fluorescent lights, paint, insulation, and even certain unmarked and sealed containers have been finding their way into the lakes of Harrietsfield over the past 20 years. My question to the Minister of Environment is, will you undertake today to investigate this situation, particularly at Weavers Lake, to have neighbouring well waters tested and report back to this House?
Now, Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If there are particulars of instances that are taking place that are occurring now that are hazardous to people or the environment, I'd certainly encourage the member to report the particulars of those, and we certainly will investigate.
Member for Halifax Atlantic on your final supplementary.
So, Mr. Speaker, the well water tests, and particularly those which are required to test for heavy metals, are very expensive. Some testing would provide immediate relief for these residents and ease a great many people's minds. Will the department undertake at the very least to do the well water testing for them?
Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the member opposite if she would provide me with some details. We certainly will look into this situation.
Honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in February of this year, Mr. Speaker, about 600 stakeholders in education were brought together in Truro to share ideas and express concerns about education in our province. It is now the end of April. My question through you, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister of Education is, can the Minister explain to Nova Scotians what has been done in his department with the information generated at the forum?
Mr. Speaker, there was reference to that in the budget speech yesterday, but I can tell the honourable member is that in response, using information was there coupled with information and input from other sources, there will be a plan released, I believe, next month where the honourable member will see the direct result in print of some of the activities that will occur to improve education in Nova Scotia. As a result of that forum, which, Mr. Speaker, was we had tremendous feedback on, and I believe probably was the first of its kind ever held in this province, and it was a good thing.
Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, education in Nova Scotia is clearly critical to our future. The Learning for Life and other documents that the Department of Education has in the works have not yet reflected the feedback from Nova Scotians, and we were assured that the Education Forum would be included in the budget. I'm wondering if the Minister could explain to us why our expectation was that the feedback from the Education Forum would be presented with the budget, as was suggested, I think, by the Minister of Finance in his speech to the Halifax Chamber of Commerce lunch.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, there are a number of things that are contained in the budget which reflect input from that forum. There will be more detail forthcoming, and I want to tell you that in reference to that, if I hope the honourable member did see the release from the Nova Scotia School Boards Association, and I believe the operative word about the funding announcement from the budget for public school education was tremendous.
Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that was mentioned because, in fact, Nova Scotians have come to expect very little in the way of education funding. They've received so little that even crumbs that come their way now are welcomed and cheered onward. But in fact, what was given to education was very small, and I think that that's important to make that point. Now, Mr. Speaker, some Nova Scotians are concerned that the outcome of the forum was decided before the 600 people traveled to Truro, that perhaps the results were predetermined. And if, in fact, they have not been collated and put together, and yet our budget is based on it, I would question the minister about how their results have actually been reflected in the budget that began months ago. Thank you.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Speaker, the feedback from the forum was reviewed and analyzed, and as the honourable member will remember, is that there was a discussion paper posted on the website, and those who weren't able to attend the forum in person were certainly given the opportunity to make their impact. Another document was prepared and sent back to the partners, and we did hear what they said. Their feedback was also posted on the website, and there will be a release, as I said, in response to the first question, Mr. Speaker, in May.
Honourable Member for Halifax, Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, this past winter, the Minister of Community Services reluctantly admitted that there weren't enough beds for the homeless in local emergency shelters. And then the minister looked under the cushions in his office and he found some resources. And Pendleton Place opened, Mr. Speaker, with 40 beds in the basement of St. Pat's Church. Mr. Speaker, almost fully occupied nightly since it opened. Time is running out now on Pendleton Place, which will close its doors this weekend on April 30th. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the minister to inform this House what his plans are for the homeless who have been relying on Pendleton Place for somewhere to sleep.
Good question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for her question, and it is a pertinent question. I would like to start by also acknowledging the excellent work of the organizations that help the homeless and others who may be less fortunate in the area, because it was working with them that we reached the conclusion that we needed a Pendleton Place, and I agree it has been a success. Mr. Speaker, this has been a good initiative. There's been excellent service provided by the staff of Pendleton Place to the homeless in the community. We've learned a lot from it. We're continuing to work with all the agencies that provide shelter to the homeless. We're learning those lessons, and once we have made provision to care for every single person in Pendleton Place, we will be moving forward with those plans.
Member for Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
Thank you very much. Well, apparently the minister isn't prepared to share publicly what he's learned, Mr. Speaker. More than 70% of those who have been staying at Pendleton Place, Mr. Speaker, are men. And many of these men are people who have chronic addictions, mental health disorders, and they've been barred from most of the other shelters. In fact, all of the other shelters. And without a place to sleep, Mr. Speaker, they could have frozen to death on the streets this winter. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say to the minister, now that the mercury is above freezing, is he prepared to walk away from Pendleton Place?
Right on, Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the member opposite brings up a very key and common factor in the residents of Pendleton Place and the other shelters. A lot of them do struggle from mental health challenges. There are addiction problems, and in fact, often in the case of the members that she's speaking of, or the particular residents, there may be incidents of past violence which have created problems in getting into the other shelters. We have been working with the Department of Health, and we look forward to, hopefully with the assistance from the Capital District Health Authority, to be able to provide the extra resources that are necessary to help those they're called hard-to-house residents, and we will be moving forward on that plan.
Member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Capital District Health Authority doesn't have the resources to provide elective surgery on a regular basis. I don't know how in the name of heavens they're going to be able to deal with homelessness. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand how this minister's mind works. The number of homeless The number of homeless has steadily been rising, and the best this minister can do is give us a temporary shelter, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the minister, when will he get serious about a proper plan for housing, long and short term, for people who are homeless in this province?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the whole Pendleton Place pilot project has been a great catalyst for bringing together the Adsum House, the Barrie Houses, the YWCA, the Metro Turning Points, and the Salvation Army. And in fact, there's more communication between those organizations now, and a recognition that, in fact, there is a significant number of empty beds every night in this part of the province. They are working together collaboratively now to put together a plan. We're working with them, Mr. Speaker. That plan will be in place, and we will be caring for the people that are presently housed in Pendleton Place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too have a question for the Minister of Community Services. Over the past 6 months, the Minister of Community Services has been engaged in negotiations with the federal government for a federal, provincial and territorial agreement on early learning and child care. My question to the Minister is, what is the status of this agreement?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for bringing this up, because this agreement is a huge boon to Nova Scotia families and children, particularly low-income ones that are looking for better access to early learning and childcare services. And Mr. Speaker, I have been working collaboratively with my staff, my federal, provincial and territorial colleagues, and on February the 11th in Vancouver, I thought that we had an agreement between all parties, but unfortunately there was a last-minute objection by one of the ministers that prevented us from reaching an agreement, Mr. Speaker, that would provide $20.4 million to families and children in Nova Scotia this year.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on your first supplementary.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister of Community Services is, what are the terms of this particular federal, provincial, territorial agreement, particularly as it relates to cost, the number of children that would be affected, that would benefit, essentially, and particularly as it relates to the Quad principle?
The honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for bringing up this very important topic. The Quad principles, which are the basic principles upon which the agreement is structured on, stand for quality, universality, and that all children would be welcomed to the plan regardless of their backgrounds. Accessibility, and that goes to affordability, and developmental, which speaks to the educational component of it. Mr. Speaker, in working with the sector and from actually before we started these negotiations, we have identified certain targets. And what I would like to see, Mr. Speaker, as a result of this, that there be no more waiting list for families that need subsidized child care, that more families would get subsidized child care, and that we'd bring some stability to this sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Cape Breton West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, what is he doing to secure, what is his government doing to secure this $20.4 million that would benefit families and in particular children in light of the political uncertainty in Ottawa?
The honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is really the question that I'm surprised that I wasn't asked previously by perhaps one of the opposition parties, because, Mr. Speaker, there is a tremendous benefit there for low-income families. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, this government is prepared to work on a bilateral basis with Ottawa. If we're not able to achieve a federal, provincial, territorial agreement, a letter has been sent to the federal minister indicating our willingness to enter into a bilateral agreement with the federal government on a program that addresses the flexibility we need to help families and children in Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his question.
The member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister responsible for the Workers' Compensation Board. One of the biggest challenges for the Workers' Compensation Board is the unfunded liability, which continues to grow. In order to keep that under control, the board needs a strong board of directors that understands the needs of both business and workers. Could the minister confirm today that Mr. Gary Dean and Mr. Neville have had their appointments extended on the Workers' Compensation Board as non-voting members? Good question.
Environment and Labor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are ongoing discussions with stakeholders currently to look at the Board of Directors on the Workers' Compensation Board. Those discussions have been going very well, and we're looking forward to ensuring that there's a full complement of directors and that they will be there representing their stakeholders.
Honourable Member for Preston on your first supplementary.
Well, that's not the answer I was looking for. I'm going to table a letter here that was written to me by the minister, and it clearly states, the interim board chair, in the interim, the board chair has the discretion to ask members to continue under Section 151B and has done so with Mr. Dean and Mr. Neville, who will continue as non-voting members. And that's quite important. Mr. Speaker, it appears that Gary Neville lives in Florida, and is far removed from the challenges facing the board and its clients, and again, as a non-voting member of the board. Could the minister confirm today that Mr. Dean, Mr. Dean.
Order, please. Now, Member Preston has the floor.
That's Mr. Dean. Sorry about that. Could the minister confirm today that Mr. Dean is collecting expenses from the board meetings and whether that includes travel to and from Florida for board meetings?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labor.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, I don't know where the gentleman lives, but I suspect it's quite unlikely that any travel expenses are being paid.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your final supplementary.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with the minister's answer there, because we seem to have, there seems to be a feeling around that could be the case. He lives in Florida. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Dean is also a well-known former Tory fundraiser. So much for anti-patronage stance of this Premier. Could the Premier indicate today whether he thinks that it's okay that a Workers' Compensation Board member lives in Florida and is making decisions on behalf of Nova Scotians, especially when it appears to be a political appointment?
Good question.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have no information that the board member that is being discussed today lives in Florida, but if the member opposite has information to that, the government would be interested in it. But I have no information that that particular board member lives in Florida.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you, my question is to the Minister of Education. Now, Mr. Speaker, for years now, the town of Dominion has been without their school. It's not unlike this community did not have a school before, Mr. Speaker. It needs one now, and it certainly deserves one now. This high school was taken away by subsidence, an issue the federal government has chosen to ignore time and time again. Now, there's been much talk in this chamber in the last few days about education and how important it is to our children. So I want to ask the Minister of Education, will you commit to putting a school in the town of Dominion where it so rightly belongs?
Education.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of the McDonald complex in Dominion was certainly unfortunate when that high school did subside. The fortunate thing, Mr. Speaker, is that there is excess capacity in a good many of the schools up in that area of Cape Breton. Certainly Beck, I think, has a capacity of 2,000 students. It has about 11. The population of Glace Bay High is going down, and it has capacity too. The fortunate thing, Mr. Speaker, is despite the fact that they lost the McDonald complex in Dominion, the students from Dominion are still having access to a first quality education.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'll agree with one section. Those both schools he talked about are fine facilities. But the importance, moreover, though, Mr. Speaker, is the availability of a school in a community. We all know the importance of what a school means to communities in any part of this province, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a focal point in the community, Mr. Speaker. So my question is, why won't you do the right thing, Mr. Minister, and build a school in Dominion for the residents of that community?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the elementary students still attend school in the community of Dominion. The fact is that the school board recognizes that there are more other areas where school construction, they believe, is needed more. I want to draw to the member of the member from Cape Breton Centre is that in terms of school construction, I think since this government has come to office, there are 14 new schools either that have been opened or are on the planning board, including a new junior high in Glace Bay, which is being built so that the capacity of that school will certainly be ample to absorb the students who would at one time would have gone to McDonald Complex in Dominion.
Honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what I'm trying to tell the minister, but he doesn't seem to get it. It's not about capacity. The argument coming from this side of the floor is not about capacity. It's about compassion. It's about the understanding in a community what the school means to it. Now, Mr. Speaker, next year marks the 100th anniversary of the town of Dominion. It's a great municipality, Mr. Speaker, and it would be a great thing for this government to step forward and say, we recognize that, and as part of their celebration say, we want this to see another 100 years, and we're going to support your children. So I'm going to ask the minister once again, why don't you do the right thing? Get together with the school board and build a school in that community so it can help it thrive, and new people will come there and build homes and live there. Thank you.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, one of the first parent groups or community groups that I met with was the group of parents and school advisory committee and those in the town of Dominion. Mr. Speaker, we had a very good discussion in which they made an excellent presentation, by the way. I think when I wrote back to them, I think I told the member from Cape Breton Centre how impressed I was with the presentation that was made at that school board meeting by the people representing Students Dominion. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that the Cape Breton Victoria School Board is able to accommodate those students and provide first quality education in facilities that are very close to Dominion. And you know, if the school board chooses to make a school in Dominion and put it #1 on their capital priority list, then clearly the department and those who study such things would take a look at it.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are over 4,700 Nova Scotians who are waiting to have their claims for chronic pain processed. The board said that they will have a plan ready to deal with these by the end of this month. My question is to Minister responsible for Workers' Compensation Board. The month is almost over, Minister. When can we expect a plan for the Workers' Compensation Board to deal with these 4,700 plus claims?
Honourable Minister of Environment Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion at the Workers' Compensation Board with regards to the chronic pain claims, and a team is being put together to make sure that they are expedited and that those claims are adjudicated.
The honourable member for Preston on your first supplement.
Thank you very much. The number seems to grow, and there was a recent hearing that actually the number is over 6,000 now. Mr. Speaker, the WCB has an obligation to process these claims as quickly and fairly as possible. Some people have suffered for several years if this plan is not a good one, losing their assets and their dignity. What assurance can the minister give that these claims will be processed without delay before further financial stress is placed on the claimants and their families?
The Minister of Environment Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Workers' Compensation Board is in the process of hiring an additional 70 staff to take care of chronic pain claims, and I'm confident that this will take care of the issue and that those claims will be moved through the system just as quickly as possible.
The honourable member for Preston on your final supplementary.
Well, that's not a good enough answer. You've got to have people there. It's going to be over a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 4 years. No particular time this is going to happen. In the meantime, people are losing their assets and their dignity. When can the minister fulfill the Supreme Court directive that this must be addressed? The question to the minister is, why won't the minister address this issue so that the workers can get the compensation they are entitled to before they lose everything?
Honourable Minister of Environment Labour.
Continue.
Mr. Speaker, I think hiring 70 people to look at claims is significant, and I think those 70 people, along with the team that is already in place to look at chronic pain, will make a significant difference and reduce the amount of time that those people have to wait.
Honourable Member Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. In 2001, the federal government issued a ministerial order quarantining over 70,000 hectares in HRM because of the spruce longhorn beetle. My question to the Minister is, what is the status of this particular infestation?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I must say that this government saw a need to help the people in the Eastern Shore, and the good member from the Eastern Shore brought it to my attention. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that in December, I was to Eastern Shore. We had a community meeting with the citizens of the area, and we committed up to $1 million to help the people in that community, Mr. Speaker. I can also tell you, Mr. Speaker, we have tried and tried and tried working with CFIA with no avail. I have went to Ottawa with a good member from Eastern Shore, Mr. Speaker, and asked the federal minister to help us in the need to address the concerns of the citizens of the Eastern Shore. I have wrote numerous letters, Mr. Speaker, to the federal minister, and to this day, Mr. Speaker, I have not had a reply from any letter or our trip to Ottawa.
Order, please. The Honourable Member Cape Breton West.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't mean to get the minister's blood pressure a little up, but within this area, Mr. Speaker, there are 2,900 hectares that have been identified as completely infested because of this particular worm or bug. To date, less than 500 hectares have been cleaned.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable Member Cape Breton West has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, of the 2,900 hectares that have been identified as infested, less than 500 hectares have been cleaned to date. At this rate, it'll take about 20 years to clean. So I guess my question to the minister is, how much is this going to cost, and what is the timeline?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can tell the honourable member and all members in the House that the process that we put in place in December has been very successful to date. We've cleaned up approximately 10 lots. We have 2 contractors that are willing to go back into the quarantine zone as soon as the roads are opened, and we are working with CFIA to ask them to lift the ban so that they can process the wood because of the potential fire hazard that's in the area. But, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to also mention that the member from Preston was at the meeting that evening, and he criticized that our government was not doing enough that evening for the citizens. But I have yet to see that member stand up and ask the federal minister to write a reply to this government. What we've asked for is a commitment from that government for $3 million to help the citizens out of the area that needs help.
Order. Order. Order, please. Order, please. Time allotted for question period has expired. The honourable member for Richmond on point of order.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday and again today, the Premier made reference that the federal bill dealing with the Atlantic Accord, Bill C-43, was taken off the order paper in Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, in fact, this bill was debated last Friday, April 22nd, and I can table reference to that. Debate continued until a motion from Committee of Non-Confidence, which was introduced by the Conservatives, pushed Bill C-43 off the order paper so that debate on that non-confidence motion could take place for the rest of the day. Today, Mr. Speaker, the Premier said that he reviewed the order paper for the House of Commons and noted that Bill C-43 was not on the order paper for next week, in which he concluded meant it could not come to a vote. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would hate to accuse the Premier of misleading.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. It's not a point of order. It's disagreement of the facts between the members. It's not a point of order. The honourable House Leader for the Opposition Party on the opposition member's business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we please call resolution number 3373?
Resolution number 3373. The honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The resolution reads, therefore be it resolved that this government take immediate action to ensure that Nova Scotia's nonprofit sector can obtain affordable liability insurance. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to rise here today to speak about a sector of activity in this province that is near and dear to my heart, the voluntary sector. This sector is called many things: nonprofit, not-for-profit, non-governmental organization or NGO, civil society, third sector, and community-based sector. In the past number of years, the term voluntary sector is being used because all these organizations have one thing in common: their boards of directors are volunteers. However, it's not what these organizations are called, but the threat to what they do that is the issue to be discussed today. And that issue is liability insurance. And this includes organizational liability when working with at-risk and vulnerable populations, directors and officers' liability for the executive leadership of the organizations, and staff and volunteer liability for the programs and services that they provide. The difficulty in getting liability insurance and the cost to those organizations that are able to even obtain it is threatening their very survival and therefore our quality of life here in Nova Scotia. This is an important issue because these organizations provide essential programs and services to our citizens. They also support 1 out of every 3 Nova Scotians as volunteers, giving over 47.2 million hours, or the equivalent of 25,000 jobs, and nearly $2 billion annually. How this insurance issue is impacting on the voluntary sector in Nova Scotia and Canada is well documented. Stories highlighted in the 2003 publication that was issued in Nova Scotia by the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia, Recreation Nova Scotia, Sport Nova Scotia, the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia, and the Canada Volunteerism Initiative Nova Scotia Network, entitled Insurance, It's Everybody's Business. Also, a number of examples were presented last fall to the Nova Scotia Insurance Review Board. Actually, 35 of the 84 verbal presentations to the board were from the nonprofit from the nonprofit representatives, and they represented over 1,000 organizations here in Nova Scotia. Also last year, the National Voluntary Forum did a cross-country regional session on the issue of liability in a number of different provinces. So to summarize the issue in Nova Scotia, insurance premiums for the nonprofit sector are increasing between 35 and 300% or more. In fact, one group reported a 730% increase in their liability insurance premium. It is very difficult for nonprofits to budget for unpredictable and often large increases, and volunteers, quite frankly, are reluctant to spend their time to fundraise for an organization just to pay the insurance bill. Another issue is that the insurance industry itself has increased the number of activities that it considers either high risk or too complex. Care of children, including child care, boys and girls clubs, teen health clinics, summer camps, and field trips have all been considered high risk. Legions, community events, and fundraisers such as parades, fairs, and festivals are now entering into that category, as are active sports and recreational activities. Some organizations are limiting their programs or even closing them down as a result of not being able to get liability insurance or having to pay too much. Community health boards are reporting to us that their exercise programs are at risk or have been cancelled. So this is a threat to our social and health programs, to culture and tourism, and other public policy priorities. And we should be seeing the government take more proactive steps to help out the voluntary sector. Another insurance issue that's impacting on the sector is that insurers are starting to screen board members. they're actually reviewing or asking to review board members' resumes before determining an organization's final cost for director's liability. One can only assume that the more capable the insurance company decides the board to be, the lower the premium for director's liability. Also, many volunteers on boards of directors are feeling overwhelmed by the work and responsibilities of managing risk in their organizations. Another area of concern is that it's been reported to me that a homeowner who was renewing their personal home insurance policy was asked whether or not they were a member of any nonprofit boards in Nova Scotia. One can only assume again that board participation would influence the rate of house insurance, and possibly the insurer was looking at the home as an asset should that person be liable as a volunteer. So no wonder potential board members are being very cautious about this level of volunteering. And this is fear-mongering of the worst kind. And getting people to serve on boards of directors is actually becoming quite a crisis in Nova Scotia. People are becoming more and more reluctant. Yet, surprisingly, most voluntary sector organizations are claims-free, and the insurance industry has no information to dispute this. So the impacts of the current insurance crisis are serious. We've actually had some experience with just the higher premium side. And in the 1980s, voluntary leaders know what to expect based on that experience. At that time, and we predict it's continuing to happen, volunteers are unwilling to fundraise to cover insurance costs. And in fact, a lot of volunteers are dropping off because that's the only responsibility they're given because of the pressure on nonprofit organizations to fundraise. We predict there are going to be staff cuts. There'll be loss of programs and services. And we've already seen the cancellation of festivals and community events. And often these community events are used as fundraisers for a number of different organizations within that community. So there's a ripple impact. And unfortunately, we're probably looking at the closure of some facilities and organizations. When you add these insurance pressures to the lack of stable core funding for the voluntary sector, governments and communities can no longer assume that the services and programs long provided by volunteers will continue to exist. So the provincial government has to treat these threats as seriously as it would any other sector of the economy. Estimates have ranged from 7 to 10% in terms of the value of the voluntary sector to the economy of this province. And we're past the stage of Band-Aid solutions.
Order. Time has expired. I'll recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise today to speak about the tremendous value of nonprofit groups that they provide to our province and our people. From hiking trails to festivals to indeed the health service delivery in this province, nonprofit groups and their volunteers are essential to the health and well-being of Nova Scotians. The resolution correctly says that these groups help our children be active and provide communities programs and activities. No one appreciates the value of volunteers and the work they do more than the government of Nova Scotia. By giving freely of their time and talents, many Nova Scotians enrich their communities. This resolution deals with the issue of volunteers and insurance. Mr. Speaker, we deal with insurance both at the Department of Environment and Labour with the Insurance Act and at Transportation and Public Works, where risk management is part of their mandate. In 2002, recognizing the possibility of assaults through the courts were putting nonprofit organizations in a difficult position, this government passed the Volunteer Protection Act. It is designed to protect volunteers as long as those volunteers and officials are properly trained and screened. As relatively new legislation, the Volunteer Protection Act has not yet been tested by the courts. So even with the act in place, nonprofit organizations should confirm with their broker that their volunteers are protected under our general liability coverage for acts they perform on behalf of their organizations. The concept of personal responsibility continue to deteriorate in today's society. Awards for successful liability claims are rising in Nova Scotia. Also frightening is the fact that the range of persons named in such lawsuits is expanding. Even though nonprofit organizations may not seem a likely target for a huge cash award, the personal assets of their directors and their board members may actually be at risk. That means nonprofit organizations must protect their organizations and their volunteers from claims. It's important that their liability coverage should provide for both legal costs and settlement. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Environment Labour has produced an outstanding brochure called Insurance and Your Nonprofit Organization that provides excellent advice to those organizations. Over the past few years, some nonprofit groups were facing rising insurance premiums due primarily to rising liability costs throughout the country. It became a major problem for Nova Scotia trail groups when the cost of liability insurance became unaffordable. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Trails Federation came to us for help. We could not let the 139 trail groups and snowmobile groups close down because of skyrocketing insurance bills. With our experience in dealing with the insurance industry, we agreed to help the Trails Group look for a solution to their immediate problem. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to tell this House and all Nova Scotians that the issue for Trails Groups has been resolved. The Nova Scotia government helped facilitate a liability insurance program for Trails Groups so they can afford to maintain their insurance coverage and keep their trails open for the benefit of all users. Nova Scotia Trails Federation have been in the process of informing their members of this agreement and have just today issued a news release to that fact. And Mr. Speaker, I'm quite pleased to table this release from the Nova Scotia Trails Federation heralding the good news of which I have spoken. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I would be happy to explain a bit more about this agreement on behalf of the Trails Federation. Nonprofit groups which develop and maintain the province's network of hiking trails have seen their insurance rates soar over the past few years. This year, they faced the largest increase of all, a rate jump which would have forced many groups to close their trails at the end of April. Under the new arrangement, no group will pay higher rates than it paid last year. When the Trails Group came to us, we had the Departments of Natural Resources, Health Promotion, and Transportation and Public Works come together to address the issue. We worked with insurance providers on behalf of the Trails Group to secure a program that is accessible, affordable, and sustainable. The 139 not-for-profit groups that provide trail opportunities in Nova Scotia will have access to the coverage through the Nova Scotia Trails Federation. Yes. We're providing a service to the trail groups because they need some support in finding the right insurance program. Because claims for trail groups have been minimal, there's no justification for high insurance rates. High claims in other provinces have driven up the rates in Nova Scotia. Under the new program, only claims in Nova Scotia will be considered when setting the rates, and a claims history specific to Nova Scotia will be created, eliminating the need for price hikes. We expect the Trails groups will be able to stand on their own within 5 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now that the immediate problem for trails groups has been resolved, we can turn our attention back to the issue of insurance costs that some not-for-profit groups are facing. Again, our government committed itself to working with non-profits to address the high cost of liability insurance. In the meantime, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, recognizing that Atlantic Canada seems to be bearing the brunt of high premiums but not recording high claims, agreed to specifically examine the issue. In February of this year, the Insurance Bureau of Canada created a task force focused on insurance issues affecting commercial and not-for-profit sectors in Atlantic Canada. And Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to table this press release that addresses this particular issue. As I understand it, the group has met twice, in fact, as recently as yesterday. The first meeting was in early March, and the mandate of the Atlantic Task Force on Insurance Availability and Affordability is to develop recommendations and communications intended to increase insurance availability, affordability, and understanding for commercial and not-for-profit sectors in Atlantic Canada. Now, this, Mr. Speaker, is a very important initiative because it recognizes the specifics of our area of the country. The task force is comprised of representatives of affected stakeholder groups from the commercial and not-for-profit sectors across Atlantic Canada, the government, and the insurance industry. I understand that the task force final report will be ready sometime this summer. Our government has already agreed to assist volunteer and not-for-profit groups in facilitating a similar agreement to the Trails Federation. Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that when it comes to insurance liability, not all nonprofit groups are the same. We would establish criteria to assist not-for-profit groups address their long-term insurance needs. They must, of course, be a not-for-profit organization, must be funded in part by the Nova Scotia government, must provide a service for Nova Scotians as defined by the Act, program, or service. We will be developing an inventory of not-for-profit groups that deliver government programs and explore alternative risk options. We'll be looking at the cost of coverage versus budgets. We'll be looking at a program that would cover an umbrella not-for-profit sector rather than individual or separate groups. Mr. Speaker, this is the commitment we are making to a vital and necessary sector of our province. We will await the Insurance Bureau's task force report, and, Mr. Speaker, we will take it from there. Mr. Speaker, I've been extremely pleased to be able to participate in this debate and report some very real progress with respect to the issue of insurance for not-for-profit groups in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada. And Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat, having said that.
I recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, pleasure to rise, speak on Resolution 3373. Which was introduced by the Mayor from Halifax Fairview, and I commend him for introducing it, and I want to commend the member from Dartmouth South Portland Valley for her comments on this. And I must say that I'm a bit surprised to see that the government would have the Minister of Health respond on this. I would think that the gentleman who has a department that consumes half the provincial budget might have a few more things to do, and maybe a few of his colleagues sitting in the back rows might have a bit more time on their hands to be doing this task rather than the Minister of Health. But then again, I guess we now see why there's not enough specialists, and wait times continue to be a problem in this province when he consumes his time on these matters rather than share it with some of his colleagues. But I digress.
The honourable member that you're talking on Bill Resolution number 3373.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me say right from the start therefore be it resolved that this government take immediate action to ensure Nova Scotia's non-profit sector can obtain affordable liability insurance. Let me say from the start that our caucus certainly is in support of this motion, and based on the comments from the Minister of Health on behalf of the government, I would certainly assume that this motion is going to be successful and is going to be adopted by the House based on his remarks and based on what they intend to do. So I'm looking very forward to this coming to a vote and it being unanimously passed, because I've made it clear, well, certainly the NDP supported, they introduced it, we support it. It seems that based on the comments from the Minister of Health that the government supports it. So I think today is a wonderful opportunity to have this resolution passed. And about the only thing that would stop the resolution from passing, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, is that when the government, well, the last speaker in this case is going to be a member of the NDP party, and so hopefully they will leave a few minutes left so we can have the vote on the resolution. And you know, unless the only way that this could be prevented, as you know, Mr. Speaker, is if a government member were to jump up and to take up the rest of the debate, which would deny a vote on this important resolution. And I certainly would hope that that would not be the case, based on the fact that every single member in this House has non-profit volunteer groups in our ridings, and certainly members who, if they're effective at all, would certainly be aware of the challenges that have been faced by those non-profit groups, and it's throughout the province. And I think we've all heard stories from our groups of the challenges that they face, and more, Mr. Speaker, it's evident that people are shying away from getting involved in volunteer organizations. And a great part of that is because of the burden that's put on them, the challenges that they are faced with, and one of the big ones that's become a reality is insurance liability. Now, Mr. Speaker, this government did attempt to try to address some of those concerns when a couple of sessions ago they passed the Volunteer Protection Act. And the idea of that act was if you were a volunteer for an organization, unless you committed some sort of criminal offense, that if you were just carrying out your responsibilities, you couldn't be held liable. Now, what immediately happened after that act is that volunteers in Richmond County started calling and saying, does that mean we no longer need liability insurance because the government passed the Volunteer Protection Act? I said, well, now let's find out. Before you cancel your insurance, let's call the Department of Justice. And lo and behold, the response from the Department of Justice was, no, tell them not to cancel their liability insurance, and they should continue to have liability insurance. Which begs the question, why did we have a Volunteer Protection Act to protect volunteers if the Department of Justice and this government is still telling them that they need liability insurance? So that's one of the issues that I wanted to address today on this. The second one becomes the issue of affordability. Now, we all realize that insurance has gone up. Car insurance has gone up. Home insurance has gone up. Liability insurance has gone up, both for the business sector, the private sector, and for the volunteer sector. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, our province is blessed with volunteers. We just had the volunteer recognition banquet a couple of weeks ago. Hundreds of volunteers recognized throughout our province. Each municipal district was able to nominate a provincial volunteer. And so we realize that we're blessed with hardworking Nova Scotians who give freely of their time to these nonprofit organizations that make our community stronger. And the question becomes, what can we do as a government and as elected officials to try to make their job easier? Try to make sure that at the end of the day that someone who's volunteering out of the goodness of their own heart for their community, for their family, for our province, is not going to be faced with liability, and that they are properly covered, and that it's not costing the organization an astronomical amount of money. What's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, is that this government has spent a lot of time talking about auto insurance. But the fact is that there are other pressing matters dealing with the insurance industry. I think it was mentioned before by the member from Dartmouth South Portland Valley, the issue of home insurance. And I've spoken about this issue before. More and more residents in my own riding are having to give up their home insurance. I gave the example before and I'll give it again. She's now 91 years old, had insurance all her life. An inspector came to her house. It's a relatively smaller home, and she has one of these old-style stoves in the kitchen. It's one of those stoves where you can burn wood on one side, you've got a bit of an oven, and you actually have a cooking surface. And they're quite large. Now, when I went to see her and she told me, they said, I have to show them the Canada Safety Inspection number on the stove or it's got to go. And she's looked with a smile and she said, I don't think Canada Safety Inspection existed when they made the stove. And I think she was right. So they told her, to keep your insurance, you have to get the stove out of the house. And she looked at me and she said, well, look at the stove, look at my door, and explain to me how I'm going to get that out of this house. Now, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned before, it's a small house. Looking back, I believe they put the foundation, brought the stove in, and then they put the walls up in the roof, because that's the only way they got that stove in that house. And to take it out, she'd have to cut out half the house, the side of the house, to get the stove out. So what was the result? After having insurance all of her life, she now goes to bed without any sort of insurance on her home. That's a serious issue, and this government has turned a deaf ear to those concerns. And it doesn't want to talk about insurance. It talks about some of the success that was achieved in the auto insurance industry, and yet it doesn't want to address home insurance, liability insurance. We've heard from the private sector. More and more, they are faced with challenges dealing with increased insurance. Some cases, it's double, triple, quadruple, just not sustainable. And that's a challenge for the private industry. But the thing with the private industry, they're there to make profits, and they do try to bring in money to address some of those added financial burdens they have. But nonprofit groups, how can we sit back and allow nonprofit groups have to take the money that they raise, which for the most part is reinvested in the community, whether they be through bursaries, supporting churches, supporting local groups, supporting our youth? How can we sit back and see that a big chunk of what should be reinvested in the community is going to pay for liability insurance, which continues to go up? I've seen it in my own community again with a lot of our economic development groups. These are volunteers that are trying to raise money to reinvest back in the community. They try to hold functions, outdoor concerts, everything else. And it's become to the point where they're saying, we're not making any money. We are going through a great deal of organization, of time, of effort, and at the end of the day, half our profits, or a good chunk of our profits, just goes to pay the insurance. And they're saying it's not worth it. And who's the big losers in that, Mr. Speaker? Well, it's us. It's our province. It's our communities. We are the losers. And I am pleased to see that the Insurance Bureau has said that they wanted to put forward a task force. Well, it's too bad that this government didn't put forward a task force. It's too bad that this government didn't sit down and ask that the UARB or that another body look specifically at the issue of liability insurance for nonprofit groups. And what better time to do it? After we've had Provincial Volunteer Week, we've recognized the importance of our volunteer. A couple of years ago was the Year of the Volunteer. There's no better time. The silence of this government is deafening. It is hurting our communities, it is hurting nonprofit groups, and it sends the wrong signals. We have a proud history of volunteers in this province. We wish to encourage that. It will make our province stronger, make our community stronger. I again congratulate the member for bringing forward the motion, and again, based on the comments from the Minister of Health, I look forward to seeing this resolution coming to a vote and being passed unanimously by the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today on the resolution, which the operative part of which reads as follows: therefore be it resolved that this government take immediate action to ensure that Nova Scotia's nonprofit sector can obtain affordable liability insurance. My colleague from Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, has laid out the problem, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions, or what may be some solutions. Now, the government has been slow to pick up the ball on this question of liability insurance. Or has it? Because what the government has done is left everybody under a bit of a shroud of secrecy, wrapped in a mystery. We're not sure what they're doing, and the government's not in any rush to tell us. On February 4th of this year, the Premier said, quote, his government plans to make it easier for volunteer groups to get liability insurance, end of quote. And the Premier said that there would be an internal task force which would report within a few months on what the government was going to do on the issue of liability insurance for nonprofits. But since then, there's been silence. What task force? Who's on it? What are they doing? When are they going to report? No information, Mr. Speaker, on that at all. So instead, when you have a vacuum, the IBC, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, rushes in to fill it. And they did it. But what that's done is it meant that the industry has seized control of the agenda. This is a task force on an important public policy issue dealing with organizations that are very important to the public, to the people of Nova Scotia. And who's leading that task force? Is it their government? No, it's the industry. This is the same industry that gutted our auto insurance policy, Mr. Speaker, at the same time crying poor, but it turns out that in the end they're making record profits, Mr. Speaker. We don't trust these people, Mr. Speaker, and we don't believe that the people of Nova Scotia do either, and yet this government has allowed that industry to take control of the agenda on liability insurance for nonprofit organizations. Sure, there's a couple of members on it who are associated one way or another with the government. For example, the Superintendent of Insurance of Nova Scotia is one of about 20 members. One of about 20 members. And the Nova Scotia's consumer advocate, Mr. George Jordan, is on it too, but he says he's only there to observe. He does not see it as his role to participate, only to observe. Now, Mr. Speaker, on this task force, there are many fine people. I know quite a number of them personally. Very fine people doing good work. But let's make no mistake about it. This task force is going to be controlled by the Insurance Bureau of Canada. They will be in control of the information that task force receives. They know how to control the agenda that committee addresses. They will control the information. They will control the communications. Mr. Speaker, they will control the rhythm of meetings, the length of meetings, who participates in meetings and on what terms, Mr. Speaker. So I'm very afraid about what we're going to see coming out of that task force. Because let's make no mistake about that being 20 equals sitting around a table with equal access to information. That's not true at all. The IBC has very definite views about what their problems are, Mr. Speaker, and it shouldn't be surprising to any of us that they put all the responsibility for unaffordable liability insurance on others, not on themselves. Nothing's ever their fault. There's nothing that they could do, Mr. Speaker. And to name only one example, they say that one of the reasons that Royal Canadian Legions have to pay higher insurance rates is because of liquor liability laws and liquor liability court cases. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know how I could say more emphatically it's not true. When you press them to point to the cases, they can't. When we say what's happened in the last 10 years to cause this increase in liquor liability, they can't, because it's not there. It's not true. But I will bet my bottom dollar, Mr. Speaker, that when that IBC task force report comes out, it will recommend changes in the liquor liability laws. Because that's the IBC's position, whether it's true or not, and there's nobody else in that task force who has access to the information that would allow them to disagree. Now let's talk about today's Trails Federation announcement. The minister, not the minister responsible for the Insurance Act, but the Minister of Health, stands up and says, isn't this a wonderful thing that we've done for the Trails Federation? And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It is. I'm very glad that the Trails Federation can now build their trails, manage their trails, knowing that they have insurance. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of things that the government's not telling us. The government is not telling us that the first $1 million is covered by the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the information that we have may be true, may not be true. I rather believe it's true. But the information we have is that in a draft of that news release, there was reference to the government's role, which the government insisted be taken out. Because the government wants to pretend that something else is going on here, but the reason that the Trails Federation can afford their liability insurance is because that government, all of us in fact, are paying for it. Now, Mr. Speaker, it would be very interesting to know who else is out there that can get the benefit of this insurance. If the Trails Federation can get it, well, who else can? What about the Federation of Community Health Boards, who are having tremendous difficulty finding liability insurance for things like walking classes, yoga classes, healthy living, all these things the government says it's trying to promote? Are they eligible? Do they get the advantage of this government insurance that's now been accorded to the Trails Federation? We don't know because the government's not saying. In his brief remarks today, the minister alluded to the fact that there may be a program available. And I'm very glad that our calling this resolution today has got the government actually to say, yes, there's something available, but we all need to know more. All of the nonprofits need to know if it's available, on what terms, when, who do they call? Maybe this debate will have accomplished its objective if we just get out of the minister the phone number of the person that all of these organizations should call. Because apparently there's a program available to them. Today is the first day we've ever heard about it. We need to know who to call. And the suggestion is from the member, my colleague, the member for Halifax Needham, is we don't get that number, we'll just give them the Minister of Health's number. Because apparently he knows all about this program, but none of the rest of us do. So, Mr. Speaker, here are our suggestions, because we want to help the government do the right thing. That's all we want to do over here in the opposition. We want to help the government do the right thing. So I have a few very helpful suggestions for what they could do. First of all, for heaven's sake, make the process open and public. Stop the secrecy. Let us know what's going on. Let us know what programs are available. Let us know who to call. Let us know what the criteria are for this program that the Minister of Health apparently has announced today. Bring it out of the back rooms and into the open so that everybody can take advantage of it. Mr. Speaker, second, take the agenda back from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. That is an industry lobby group. It is their job to do what is right for the industry. It is their job to promote the interest of the industry. It is the job of this government to represent the people of Nova Scotia, and it's nobody else's job. They have got to take the agenda back from the industry's lobbying arm. Third, Mr. Speaker, amend the Volunteer Protection Act. The Volunteer Protection Act is not working. It has not achieved its objective. If these nonprofit organizations cannot get affordable insurance, then what we need is to amend the Volunteer Protection Act. Mr. Speaker, and I had occasion to recently advise a nonprofit organization in my capacity as a lawyer about the impact that the Volunteer Protection Act would have on them, and I'm sorry to say that it had to be my advice that if they relied solely on the Volunteer Protection Act, they were leaving themselves open and that they needed to have insurance as well. The Volunteer Protection Act is not working. It needs to be amended so that it does work. Finally, Mr. Speaker, what the government needs to do is actually follow through on the report of the Insurance Review Board. The member for Richmond says the government should look into this. Well, the government already has. And the Insurance Review Board says that the fundamental thing that is lacking is solid information. And before we do anything to give the industry what it wants, we need to insist that the industry produces proper information to make proper decisions so that our nonprofit organizations can do their work.
Order. Allotment has expired. Recognize the NDP House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you please call Bill number 157?
Bill number 157. We'll recognize the honourable member for Halifax Shabukdale.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. The bill that we're discussing this afternoon is a proposed amendment to the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act. Members will know that when Nova Scotia Power was in public hands, that is, was a public crown corporation prior to 1992, the government took a decision. This was, of course, a Tory government under the premiership of Donnie Cameron at the time. The government took a decision to privatize that company and brought in an act called the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act. At the time, I appeared before law amendments and was responsible, I think, for one particular section being included included in the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act. That's the section that prohibits Nova Scotia Power from operating a nuclear power plant. I'm hoping today to be able to take some personal responsibility through this bill for a second section of the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act. That is a section as proposed in Bill 157 that would offer compensation to customers of Nova Scotia Power for losses of a particular kind due to extended power outages. The losses that are contemplated to be compensated for under Bill 157 are losses of food, spoiled food, that is to say, as a result of failing to be with electricity for some extended period of time. Now, there are several reasons why this ought to occur. Of course, all members will know that the immediate promptings for this bill, the immediate prompting for such a bill has to do with such events as the loss throughout the province last November of electricity due to the storm at the time. But of course, that storm is not the only occasion in recent years in which Nova Scotians have experienced some extended outages with respect to electricity. Now, it's clear that Nova Scotians have built their lives, as have many people throughout North America, throughout Western Europe, throughout much of the Northern Hemisphere in the world, on the regular, reliable availability of electricity. We use it for lighting, we use it for computers and other tools of our daily work. We use it, of course, for refrigeration, which is an important advance in terms of our fishing industry. It's an important advance in terms of how our daily lives are carried on. We use electricity in our hospitals, we use it in our schools. Indeed, in some homes, electricity is the source of heat. It's not the burning of oil, it's not the burning of natural gas, it's electricity. And there was a time, a decade ago, in fact a little more recently than that, in which Nova Scotia Power encouraged people to make electricity the fuel of choice when it came to heating their homes. So we've built our lives around reliable access to electricity. And yet, what I think has shocked and, of course, irritated many Nova Scotians in the last couple of years has been the number of occasions on which this reliable source of power has, in fact, not been there. Now, given how widespread the outages were in this past November's storm, the government asked the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board to convene a special set of hearings to look into the reliability of the system. In fact, to examine specifically what happened during that storm, but with a view to considering the overall reliability of the system. Now, I've been a participant at these hearings that have been going on all last week and for part of this week. They're ongoing. We'll hear from the board in due course. The Utility and Review Board is giving very thorough scrutiny to the issues. But you know what's very interesting about what Nova Scotia Power has had to say at these hearings? Because they have come and they have said, there's nothing wrong with our physical system. We have a great system. It is completely reliable. We did nothing wrong in the design of our system. We did nothing wrong in the maintenance of our system. We did nothing wrong in terms of how many people we have working for us on our repair crews or available to us. If we did anything wrong, they're prepared to say, it was only in communications. Our telephone system, they said, might need some improvement. But they did point out that the storm was an extraordinary event and that really no reasonable utility should really have to plan for that extensive an outage in terms of their communications with their customers. I think many of the customers would disagree with that and think that a better, more reliable communication system could be put in place. But you know what? Even more than that, I think the customers are less concerned about the communications and more concerned with the reliability of the system. If the electricity's out, they know it's out. If the electricity is out, Nova Scotia Power probably knows it's out too. And although it's comforting for customers in some way to get through on the phone to Nova Scotia Power and make sure that they know that it's out, when there's a big storm, like the storm we experienced last November, communications back and forth between customers and Nova Scotia Power are a secondary matter. It's a question of comfort after the fact. What people want is the reliability of the system. And on that part, Nova Scotia Power said, our system is completely reliable, they said. There are no problems with reliability of our system. It's built to the CSA standards. It's built to the kind of standards that prevail in most other utilities. Everything is hunky-dory, and we don't want to spend any money on it. Well, you know what? Back at Bill 157, if their system is so darn reliable, they should be very happy to be prepared to pay up when people lose food as a result of spoilage when the power goes out. What's the problem? Why should they oppose this? I do understand from some comments of theirs that they're not thrilled with this bill. But if their system is so completely reliable and built to the prevailing standards, what's the problem? Now, right now, there is a barrier to the kind of remedy that can be sought by people who feel that they have been cut off by Nova Scotia Power or inappropriately lose or suffer damage as a result of not having the electricity that they normally rely upon. And the remedy is they can sue Nova Scotia Power. Just like any other contract, if there's a breach of some kind in the contract, they can sue. Except, there's an except. And here's the big except. The big except is that in the legislation, it says that you can't sue Nova Scotia Power except if you can show that they've been negligent. Now, to a certain extent, this might be a reasonable kind of standard to have in place. And yet, that's the wrong place for it. This isn't a question of a normal kind of interaction between one independently contracting party and another. This is a question of a monopoly utility that we all have to use. And their standards should be publicly established and publicly enforced. And if they take the position that everything they're doing is fine, their customers should be enabled to claim without having to go to law and sue. Lawsuits are expensive, they're time-consuming, they require all kinds of expert evidence, and usually the amount of money for a little food spoilage is pretty tiny. It doesn't make sense to contemplate lawsuits here. So this is what Bill 157 says. Never mind lawsuits. Never mind lawsuits. Let's just set up a little automatic mechanism for compensation if, as a result of a power outage of more than 24 hours, regardless of fault, you lose your food. And we've asked the Utility and Review Board to set up the mechanism and to say what the amounts ought to be. Very straightforward. And I'll tell you something. I've gone back and I have looked at the last number of years in which there have been extended outages for Nova Scotia Power, and I have to tell you, there have been very few occasions on which there have been extended outages, but there have been a couple, like the storm, like Hurricane Juan, and so on. And when people lose in those circumstances, the company should simply pay up. And I'll tell you something else, this is not unprecedented. There are other places in the United States, New York, New Jersey, Utah, the United Kingdom, and Sweden all have similar compensation systems. This is a precedent, not a precedent. Thank you.
Time has expired. I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy, and would you allow for an introduction prior to your... Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Cape Breton Nova. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was the minister from Cape Breton North that was graciously gave me the floor. In the Speaker's Gallery today, we have two members of the Deputy Sheriff's Department have been taking into proceedings all week. We have Tammy Robinson and Greg McRae, and they're down here looking at the reclassification. So a warm welcome to the host, please. Thank you.
Indeed, welcome to the members of the Sheriff's Department. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too want to extend greetings to the members from the Sheriff's Department and hope they enjoy the proceedings today. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise to speak on second reading of Bill number 157, an act to amend the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act. Mr. Speaker, after careful consideration, the proposed bill does not represent the best interests of the utilities consumers for a number of reasons. First, this added measure will require that Nova Scotia Power pay its customers for perished food when there is a power failure. And Mr. Speaker, this payment will come at a cost. To recoup these costs, Nova Scotia Power will need to go to a rate case hearing to increase power rates. This will likely be the only way they can put out these additional and potentially high expenses. Mr. Speaker, this ultimately means that the consumer will pay higher power rates potentially. Second, Mr. Speaker, there is no way to accurately determine the dollar figure of spoiled food. And there are no provisions to gauge how much food might be lost from interrupted power service. And this could be in the millions. Eventually, Mr. Speaker, this cost will be passed along to the consumer through increased energy rates. This is not in the best interest of the consumers, nor is in the best interests of low-income Nova Scotians faced with energy costs that represent a larger proportion of their income. Mr. Speaker, in the last two major outages in Nova Scotia, consumers were protected because food stored in a freezer is an insurable item. Today, this is still the case. And the government made sure that social assistance recipients and low-income earners who weren't insured were also protected. In the aftermath of Hurricane Juan, government provided more than $800,000 to social assistance recipients to help them recover their spoiled food costs. Mr. Speaker, much of these funds were later recouped through the Disaster Financial Assistance Agreement with the federal government. And Madam Speaker, we live in a world faced with the challenge of global warming. It's creating many challenges to our environment, including our weather. Today, weather extremes are a reality. We've witnessed hurricanes, significant snowfalls, and ice storms. And Madam Speaker, we've seen that these extreme storms can affect the delivery of utilities. Environmental scientists often link weather events with global warming. That's why my department is doing our part and working on climate change initiatives that will help lessen the negative impact climate change has on our weather. And Madam Speaker, if we don't address climate change now, we'll experience more weather extremes in the future. These weather extremes, in turn, usually affect power delivery. Madam Speaker, government is taking a leadership role on behalf of all Nova Scotians and is actively addressing the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, as a result of yesterday's budget, my department will lead projects for energy-efficient housing. We'll help low-income Nova Scotians and those on modest incomes cut energy costs while also increasing awareness of greenhouse gas reduction. And Madam Speaker, government is also working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by working on a government house in order program. For example, we're developing a green procurement policy, including a policy for the purchase of hybrid vehicles. We're also using biofuels in no fewer than 20 government buildings. Madam Speaker, these and many more initiatives to come are all worthy projects aimed at meeting the challenges of global warming and lessening the extreme effect it has on our weather and on power. And Madam Speaker, it appears the intent of this bill is to protect consumers, and I think that's an honorable intent indeed. And I fully support consumer protection, and our government introduced a bill last week that will do just that. We've introduced a bill to amend the Public Utilities Act, which would allow a consumer advocate to be appointed for utility rate case hearings. This measure will also provide residential customers with a voice and with added consumer protection. But this amendment to the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act, introduced by the member opposite, would likely increase costs, or at least potentially have that impact. Ultimately, Madam Speaker, the customer could lose out by paying more for electricity. Madam Speaker, I believe these new provisions to the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act will not provide consumers with more protection, nor will it save them money. Indeed, Madam Speaker, consumers will be forced to reach deeper into their pocketbooks to pay for this amendment. Madam Speaker, although we cannot predict the frequency or the intensity of storms that trigger power outages, we can be better prepared. Next week is Emergency Preparedness Week. It's an awareness campaign to educate all Nova Scotians on how best to prepare for impending storms and emergencies. An emergency kit and a good supply of non-perishable food items will go a long ways towards getting through weather-related emergencies. It's up to each and every Nova Scotian to make sure that they have the best strategy on hand to deal with unforeseen events. Events like Hurricane Juan taught us a lot about emergency preparedness. Madam Speaker, while we never want to see another storm like Juan, we must be prepared. I encourage all Nova Scotians to take part in next week's activities and learn more about dealing with emergencies. So in summary on portion of this, Madam Speaker, this bill is not fair to the consumer because the compensation costs will ultimately be passed back to the consumer. It's for this reason, Madam Speaker, that I cannot support this bill, but I do support and understand the reason for the members' desire to see this. I also know, Madam Speaker, even from our own family's experience, as people would have, where there can be incidents that are directly the result and responsibility of the utility. You know, I had a situation with a power surge that took out my own sister's fridge, and the Power Corporation had a responsibility to pay for that. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't an act of God. It was a system problem. So issues where, for instance, people have goods perish, their equipment potentially damaged or destroyed, that's a whole other matter, and the utility has a mechanism for replacing those and providing supports. But my sister has a fridge, yes, from Nova Scotia Power, yes. And the other aspect of that, Madam Speaker, is that when you recognize, as I referenced before, the fact that in a true emergency where we're talking about, you know, acts of God or catastrophic weather systems that come in that affect the general populace, that is why we have emergency measures and why we have disaster relief. It cannot be merely just issues that are affected by matters that it will cost a lot of money. And you know, Madam Speaker, has been the case, any direct cost to the utility from outside factors provide a legitimate ability for that utility to go before the Utility and Review Board and seek appropriate compensation or offsetting rates to displace that. So it's not, I do agree, and I think the members would share the same thing, the same opinion, that those instances where the Power Corporation and its operations are at fault for potential damage to individuals' houses or perishable goods, in this case, that there has to be a recognition that there is a responsibility. But when we get into a broad-scale issues, Madam Speaker, if you're talking power, well, we have weather systems, not just power outages, when we have acts of God that affect our transportation network, that affect our airports. Just because I can't fly because we have a bad storm doesn't mean I have to go and suggest that someone owes me compensation because I can't travel at that time. Lots of events happen due to acts of God, and we have to recognize that this act, as proposed, doesn't fulfill the objective, which I think is honourable nonetheless.
We could just listen to you all night, Minister.
The honourable member from Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and speak on Bill 137. I have several points that I'd like to make in the short time that's available to us to provide some comments. The first overriding one is that I'm sympathetic to the sentiment that has brought this about, not just for personal reasons, because I was one of those thousands of Nova Scotians who lost his power during Hurricane Juan and obviously lost food as a result. The power on my street was lost for approximately a week Many people were without any means to cook food, and obviously there was a great deal that was spoiled. I, however, cannot support this piece of legislation because I think that there are some fundamental flaws with respect to it. Today, this afternoon seems to be the afternoon in part of no-fault liability. And if I could touch just for a moment on the no-fault element that I know gets the New Democrats excited, it relates to the insurance bill that was raised earlier this afternoon, and their preference is for a public system. They so often cite figures from provinces in Western Ontario. Manitoba and Saskatchewan are ones that they often refer to, and clearly, Madam Speaker, those are provinces that have no-fault public liability insurance, and they are not comparable circumstances. I know that the New Democrats are opposed to no-fault liability insurance, and the point that I've made in the past is that you can't have it both ways. This, however, is a different kind of no-fault liability. It is akin to what's known in legal terms as absolute liability. Absolute liability are those very rare circumstances, Madam Speaker, where the court holds somebody liable simply for committing an act or being a party to a single action, and it doesn't go to whether or not somebody had the requisite mindset in order to be held liable, or in the circumstances where we're dealing with government offenses where they had what's known as the mens rea. This is a highly unusual practice, and I think in these particular circumstances would be an unwarranted one. Let me talk first about the possibilities that could be covered in these circumstances. If I understand this bill correctly, and I'm sympathetic to the principle that brought it about in the first place. And I think it's incumbent on me to point out that, like so many other Nova Scotians, and like the members of the official opposition, I'm not at all satisfied that the actions of Nova Scotia Power in Hurricane Juan, in White Juan, in the outage that happened this past late fall, it might have been early winter, I guess it would have been the late fall, were at all satisfactory. It's clear to Nova Scotians that more should have been done, particularly when it comes to communications to Nova Scotians. I hope that Nova Scotia Power has come to terms with all of its challenges, given that we have had these problems, Madam Speaker, repeatedly over the last year and a half. I think the proof will be in the pudding. So far, Nova Scotians by and large are not satisfied that this company has demonstrated fully that it is able to respond to the kinds of emergencies that we have had. Nonetheless, what should happen in those circumstances, Madam Speaker, under this piece of legislation, were a truck driver to collide with a transformer that knocks out power for more than 24 hours, particularly if that truck driver may be somebody who is impaired? Obviously, in those circumstances, the responsibility should rest with the driver and the insurer of the driver in those circumstances, but this bill seems to not contemplate that. I suspect that one of the members for the NDP will rise and say that the insurance policy of the drunk driver would take precedent. Well, perhaps that is so, but it's clearly not indicated in this piece of legislation. What we have is a rather we have only two paragraphs that indicate the intention of the NDP. Next, on the occasion when Hurricane Juan ripped through Nova Scotia, if my recollection is correct, Madam Speaker, almost half of Nova Scotia consumers were left without power for at least some period of time. Consider for a moment the costs associated with that. The many freezers and the millions of dollars worth of costs that may have been captured by that. It's not at all unimaginable, if something like that were to happen again, that we would be facing increased power rates that would be intended to cover tens of millions of dollars of compensation for spoiled food. That, Madam Speaker, seems to be an unreasonable expectation in all of these circumstances, where we would have, in the end, substantially higher rates for Nova Scotia customers. Not to mention how very challenging this would be in advance of rate hearings for the Utilities and Review Board to peg what the potential costs are to the Power Corporation. Clearly, it's not an unreasonable thing for the Power Corporation to ask that their business plan be one that anticipates gains and losses over a period of time between applications. And I guess, Madam Speaker, the question that also occurs to me is, why should we just stop at food? Why do we not go further with this legislation? If we're just compensating for the loss of food, surely we could extend further to business interruption insurance for a wide variety of businesses. Let's consider, for example, the very expensive business interruption insurance. And what I'm struck by is that this bill specifically includes commercial customers, so it would include all restaurants that have lost power. For anybody who is familiar with commercial insurance, they would understand that the cost of business interruption insurance is one of the highest costs that any business could possibly have. In fact, so much so that many businesses in Nova Scotia simply feel that it is beyond their means and they don't bother to carry business interruption insurance. This would, for all restaurants, certainly in Nova Scotia, give them at least a partial, if not a substantial, element of business interruption insurance at no cost whatsoever. And what about industry? If we're on this continuum, if there's an industrial interruption at one of our large plants, shouldn't they be compensated? And they obviously are going to incur losses as well. This will be undoubtedly a popular move to bring forward a legislation that would provide people with direct compensation. But it may also, Madam Speaker, create a cottage industry out of defrauding Nova Scotia Power. The risks associated or the potential for fraudulent activity abound, and it doesn't take much of an imagination to realize how this could possibly come about. And I think there is also a theme with respect to parties coming forward with ideas that are on the surface popular pocketbook ideas that in the end, however, haven't been carefully thought through. The one that comes to mind is one that I referenced in a resolution that I brought before the House the other day, and that relates to the removal of HST from home heating fuel. Obviously, I would submit an anti-Kyoto, anti-environmental move in the circumstances, and according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, something that would favor large homeowners and landlords as well. So clearly, I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that this hasn't been fully thought through. The ultimate questions are whether or not there are appropriate mechanisms in place right now to compensate for this, and I would suggest that while they're not perfectly satisfactory, and I would point to the following, that we continue to have significant problems with access to justice, civil access to justice in Nova Scotia, that we're not just dealing with if one were to say that everyone should be able to take a claim to small claims court, it's not that simple. We don't have easy access in this province to class actions, and that is certainly something that government could begin to address or remedy to give people more opportunities. The complaints to Nova Scotia Power, I'm not sure whether they may fall on deaf ears. Complaints to the Utilities and Review Board, I think that the new Consumer's Advocate might give some teeth to a response. One needs to wait and see. It's unfortunate that it's not a more permanent position. And finally, we have insurance in Nova Scotia, and clearly this is a compensable.
Lapsed. Recognize the honourable member from Halifax Atlantic.
Yes, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It gives me pleasure to rise to speak on this bill, number 157, which is an amendment to the Nova Scotia Power Privatization Act. As we know, we're a long way past the days when you could keep food in the well. And as we know, we have advanced considerably in the ways in which we are able to, excuse excuse me, as we know, there have been considerable advances and we have developed a great dependence on electricity. This is particularly unfortunate where we have developed a great dependence on a commercial monopoly. This is the case in Nova Scotia at this point. The first thing I'd like to note is that for a company which is making profits of close to $100 million a year, every year since privatization, the concept of having to, in effect, guarantee some very, very basic level of service does not seem unreasonable. There are warranties for other products. Is there some reason that there should be no warranty whatsoever that, in fact, the Power Corporation will deliver power? We are not talking here about a no-fault system. Neither are we talking about questions of mens rea and criminal liability. We are not talking about punishment. At the very least, however, we might be talking about something which would be an incentive to the Power Corporation to continue providing power as it says that it will in fact do.
5-year parts and labor guarantee.
5-year parts and labor would be wonderful, but it's really tough to get a warranty on this kind of an ephemeral product. The interesting part, of course, is that Nova Scotia Power itself has proven itself to be a tough customer when dealing with its own customers. I would like to take a very quick detour here because in dealing with low-income consumers of power, I have come to realize that there is, in fact, in many cases, a choice that has to be made between a roof over one's head and food. And a roof over one's head, I realize, has to be accompanied by the ability to pay the power bill. I am absolutely terrified by the fact that there are customers of Nova Scotia Power living on low incomes, particularly recipients of ESIA, who, when the power has been disconnected, cannot get it reconnected without the posting of a significant bond, and in the meantime are told by Nova Scotia Power that they will have to wait a certain period of time for reconnection. The reason is that their disconnection is due to their fault. All right, Nova Scotia Power will work to reconnect the power when it is purely accidental or not the customer's fault. Nova Scotia Power will not work to reconnect the power when there is an element of fault. There is an element of punishment here, and what concerns me enormously is that I know of cases in which people are living in multiple unit apartment buildings without electricity, without food, of course, and more importantly, without light and without heat. And they are using the traditional method, open flame, in these multiple unit apartment buildings because Nova Scotia Power feels that they can wait. I'm aware of one person who has been resorting to open flame for light and heat for the last 3 weeks, and that's how long it's been taking to come through the system. So we should be aware that Nova Scotia Power is in fact a tough customer when it comes to playing the other side. Note that after the Hurricane 1 power outage, $800,000 in compensation was paid out to recipients, to low-income families and recipients of ESIA. But the entity which paid out that $800,000 was the Nova Scotia government. It was, in fact, Nova Scotia taxpayers, yet again, paying for a failure to deliver on the part of the privatized corporation, Nova Scotia Power. That entity, which we have no choice, we have no alternative to. Elsewhere in the world, there are numerous jurisdictions which actually provide for a much stricter regime of compensation. We note that in Sweden and in the United Kingdom, as well as in various states, there's discussion of automatic compensation. I think usually the figure is, well, in the United States, it's often $100 for food, unless losses can be proved of a larger amount. In the UK, £100. But note that those outages, actually, the compensation is triggered after 12 hours of lost power in a 24-hour period, or 18 hours of lost power in a 24-hour period. And in fact, in one jurisdiction, I believe it's in Sweden, If the loss of power is recurrent, there is not a set dollar fee, but there is literally a rebate of a certain number of months of previous power service. Now that is getting to be a fairly substantial kind of compensation and unpredictable. One of the things which I would think Nova Scotia Power might in fact welcome in some way is the ability to predict what it is going to be seeing. As long as we have a system which relies on lawsuits and so on, a power outage can trigger any amount of claims at this point. But at the bare minimum, lack of food with a set target is a very, very predictable number. Nova Scotia Power knows how many customers it has, how many have lost power for more than a specified period of time, and it's pretty easy to multiply the dollar figure out and know in terms of predicting its balance sheet for the coming year. I'd like to say again, of course, that this bill, I think, is a good bill because it really is leaving considerable discretion.
I'm having a hard time hearing the honourable member speak, sorry.
Thank you. Okay. This bill proposes leaving considerable discretion to the Utilities and Review Board to devise a system. All it says is, let us devise a system to ensure that at the very least food loss is compensated. We're dealing with many people who are, as I say, in the low-income brackets particularly, there are people who have no food, and to replace, if they have in fact a store of food, replacing it can be an extraordinarily difficult thing. If you look at the sorts of fact sheets that are distributed, what are the foods that can be saved? Jam, jelly, bread. Those are the inexpensive foods. Those are the foods that can be, that are not so expensive to replace. But if somebody has managed to get their hands on meat, seafood, dairy products, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, all those components, I might add, of a healthy lifestyle that the government is so proud to tout, those are also the products that really have to be jettisoned if the power has been out. Milk, another one, absolutely. So we're doing everything to encourage people who may fear that their food supply is in jeopardy to live on canned foods, jams, jellies, and breads. And although that may be the only economic reality, we certainly shouldn't be asking them yet further to compromise their nutritional status because of the fear of losing that food. And outages have become enough of a fact of life recently that in fact people do take that into account. This scheme, as I say, is quite generous at the moment when we're talking about a 24 outage period, much more generous than we see elsewhere, where only 12 or 18 hours are enough to trigger compensation. And the Utility and Review Board has it completely open to decide about the amount of the amount of compensation, whether that compensation is to be automatic or whether it needs to be claimed by customers, whether there needs to be proof of loss, whether proof of loss can in fact exceed a basic dollar figure. So the Utility and Review Board is really being left with a very, very open hand here. And what we are being told, what we are asking at this point is that the government recognize that electricity is an essential in this day and age. Food is an essential at any time, and that we have in fact stripped, in this highly electricity-dependent society, stripped many people of the ability to safeguard their food supply in any other way. So, Madam Speaker, in closing, I would say I support this bill, and I hope that in fact it will go forward to Utility and Review in time. Thank you.
Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader. Oh.
No.
The Honourable Member from Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That concludes the opposition's business for today.
Thank you. Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd ask for the consent of the House to revert to the order of business presenting reports of committees, and I would ask to have the consent of the House to do so.
Agreed.
On behalf of the Chairman of the Committee on Law Amendments, I'm directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 147, an act to amend Chapter 38 of the Acts of 2001, the Youth Justice Act, and Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, and Bill 165, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act, and the committee recommends this bill to the favorable consideration of the House without amendment. And further, Madam Speaker, I am directed by the Chairman of the Committee of the Law Amendments to report that the committee has met and considered the following bill. Bill number 145, an act to amend Chapter 140 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Elections Act. And the committee recommends this bill to the favorable consideration of the House with certain amendments. Speaker, I move that the House do now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 12 noon, and the House will sit from 12 until 6 p.m. in the order of business following the daily routine, and question period will be public bills for second reading, public bills for third reading, and committee of the whole House on bills. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, indeed. I'm sorry. Yes, I've neglected that, Madam Speaker. Very important to the honourable member from Fairview.